Some name checks from Axel already, so that's great. Thank you, Axel. And I'm going to be speaking today about my my main research focus now. I do quite a lot of policy work at home in the UK, so I'm on a group that advises the UK government and specifically on English species reintroductions. But I am based in the university, so ostensibly I'm an academic and researcher. My co-author is Joe Bellis. So he's also had some name checks already in the main conference, so he works now with the Centre for Plant Conservation, but he did his PhD with me, and actually is down the corridor from me as a visiting researcher in Liverpool. So I'm going to be talking about our joint work. A lot of it comes from various things that Joe did for his PhD and since then. And the first thing I'm going to start with is some work that he did on ectotherms, so in terrestrial insects, amphibians and reptiles, and this particular systematic review that we did was on terrestrial insects, and we're looking at translocation failure and trying to understand what was going on with these translocations. So Joe drilled through all the literature and found that in terms of failure of terrestrial insects at least, weather and climate was a really important factor in explaining why people thought, they'd put butterflies out or wetters or whatever it was, and it might have been a dry year or too much rain or something like that, but people was often attributing translocation failure to bad weather conditions. And that seemed to be it was more about weather when people talk about it in the literature, but after a certain amount of years, weather becomes climate, and so it's become a theme of our work to try and understand how climate change affects translocations. So you might remember that I presented on Monday. It feels like it was hundreds of talks ago, wasn't it? But I presented the European Translocation database, and this is some more results from that. So that's the conserved plants database, and because today I was asked to talk about site selection and using climate models, I thought what I'd do is actually look at how our practitioners that responded to the European database, how were they picking their site selection for putting plants out into the wild. And the key one that I want to draw from this one, I know the text is tiny, but at the bottom you can see that the bar's much bigger for the reason that people are selecting sites for geographical proximity to the release site. So what they're doing is they're saying we've got a release site where we need to put this plant back in, and they're selecting the donors from as near as possible, basically. Sometimes it's not very close at all, but geographical proximity seems to be one of the big reasons for selecting sites. And then in this, there we go, another bit of analysis also from the Translocation database, the plant one. You can see that this is reasons why people selected sites again, but the third one down is that the climate at the translocation site is suitable for the foreseeable future. So what we don't know is how are people deciding what is suitable in the foreseeable future? Are they using climate projections, or are they going, well, it'll be all right, or it seems like a good site, so generally it should be fine? Because what we don't think is happening is that people are using quantitative methods to assess climate niche. So that's what me and Joe work on mostly. There we go. Joe's modelling, which I'll go into the methods a bit more in the next few slides, but I just wanted to show this before we move off the site selection part of the talk, in that some of his analysis have shown that reintroductions currently, generally people are picking quite good sites, so that, foreseeable future, they're probably getting that right in terms of current climate. And so what this analysis is showing, if I just break it down, is the different bars show climatic suitability at the release site. So white is very low and black is very high suitability. And then we've got the different time slices, so you can see there's current, and then 2030, 2050, 2070 stacked up. And then the two SSPs are climate change projections, which some of you might recognise, but they're basically having the same message, that currently, actually, a lot of the release sites are currently very suitable, but in the future, they become less so. So we're going to expect that for most reintroduction release sites or outplanting sites, the climate suitability is going to deteriorate in the future. So what I'm going to do is hopefully convince you that these climate models have something, really valuable about them, rather than just sort of prospective or predictions that you can sort of take with a pinch of salt, because then what I'll also go over is some of the caveats and limitations around the models. But there is real strength for the translocation community using species distribution models, and Joe's work has shown that. So for those of you that don't know how an SDM, a species distribution model, works, or ecological niche models, or they've got lots of different names, basically we take the occurrence records for a species. In this case it's the Apollo butterfly, but it could be anything that we work with. So we've got dots on a map of where the species has been found, and then we combine that with climate variables. So we've got some temperature variables. It might be ecologically meaningful things, so it's not just like annual temperature or annual mean temperature, I should say, or some sort of very coarse measure. Sometimes they're useful, but the way that we can now get a lot of these variables is more ecological relevant things. So you might have peak temperature in the dry season, or you might have peak rainfall, or all these different sort of more seasonal variables which might exceed physiological tolerances. So we can tweak the models to be relevant to a particular species, and then together those models will tell us where the suitable, statistically, where the suitable climate niche is. So on the far side you can see that these sorts of outputs that we get, where again the darker colours are most suitable, the paler colours are least suitable, and we can then extract at the release sites exactly how suitable those sites are relative to that species climatic niche. So everything is very species driven, and we can pull out these variables for all of these different release sites. You can see in this example there'd been a failed translocation with much lower climate suitability of 0.222 in the north, and then down in further in Central Europe there'd been a successful translocation, and lo and behold that had a higher climatic suitability. So Joe did this for loads and loads of different species and came up with the following relationship, which says that increasing climate suitability equals higher translocation success. And it's a bit like, well, no wonder, that's not surprising. But we got very excited about this, because actually this evidences the value of the models, because we retrospectively looked at translocations, and even though all the practitioners were saying, it might be sort of predation, or it might be this, or it might be that, all these different reasons, we still found a climate signal in the difference between successes and failures. So we have successful translocations are generally in higher climate suitability, and the failed ones are in lower climate suitability. So because that's retrospective, we've got that benefit of hindsight. We can sort of look and say, oh yeah, we can find a climate signal, but it also means that we can confidently use that for projections into the future. And that's what this figure's showing. So again, this is ectotherms, and this is from a paper which Joyce is on as well, and it has just been accepted by Diversity and Distribution, so it should be out fairly soon, I hope. And it looks at each of these little bars are climate suitability for different species at different release sites. It looks a little bit like a sort of 3D, like an IMAX thing, because of the colours actually, but basically, again, the colours are the projections. So SSP 126 is more conservative climate change projection, and SSP 370 is more of a sort of worst case scenario projection. They're saying very similar things, and basically the x-axis along the bottom says that if the further along you are to the right, the more positive the change will be in terms of climatic suitability, and vice versa going towards the left. You can see that most of the release sites in Joe's data set fall in the negative space. So they're going to deteriorate in terms of climatic suitability over time. And this is up to, I should say, I think it's 2050. Yes, so we're using the time slice that where the average year is 2050. That's not so far into the future. And what we're saying is maybe like 3/4 of reintroductions will deteriorate climatically. What we don't know is whether they're going to deteriorate so badly that actually they'll exceed some sort of threshold, which means that population can't survive there anymore, so that our analysis can't do that. But it does raise warning flags for people that are doing translocations and might sort of think, oh yeah, it's fine at the moment, but maybe in a couple of decades time, the population is starting to sort of die out, and that might be one of the underlying factors. Okay, so after trying to convince you that SDM's climate niche models are really valuable, which they are, it's also important to be aware of like the strengths and the opportunities versus the caveats and the limitations, because it's just a tool like anything else. It's not perfect. It's not going to be a silver bullet to say, like when sometimes people come to me and Joe and say, can you predict where we should put this thing? It's like, well, we can help you predict where we'll put this thing, but we're never going to say definitely put it there because it's going to be all good, because we can't do that with the models. And so when you're looking at SDM sort of based literature, like please do that, but you know there's some sort of caveats. So the first thing is that a lot of modelling, because it's more accessible, they tend to publish things in terms of suitable, not suitable. So it's a binary output. So I've got an example here. This is my pet species, in fact my pet genus, Melanpyrum. Melanpyrum pratense is a North European hemiparasite. And what we've got in terms of projections is a map that says where it will be gained in the future, where it will be absent, where it will stay present, and where we'll lose it. So these are very coarse, you know, where will we get more of it, where won't we? Of course, if we're looking at the whole species range, that's really useful to understand range change. But for us, when we're talking about translocations, we're often very site-based, and so that's not such a useful thing. And we also know, anybody that works like sort of intimately with your species, you'll know that actually climate suitability is a sliding scale. Sometimes other factors can compensate for poor climatic suitability. So, you know, for the plants that I work on, if they have really good host connections, then that means that actually they can buffer themselves to a certain extent against poorer climate years. And so it's more of a sliding scale. So when you get sort of these reports of this is the threshold of suitability versus not suitability, then actually in the real world we know that there's loads of different factors that can affect that. So that's something that you have to sort of integrate into your decision-making system. So I think there's much more strength for us as a translocation community to use it as a relative measure. So we've got relative climate suitability. Again, this is the Melanpyrum projections. So we might have positive space in the north for us because we're in the northern hemisphere, no change really in the middle of the range, and then negative changes further south. And so we can start sort of making decisions maybe at like European scale, but also we've done it at much smaller scales where we sort of use that as a part of the decision making in terms of, you know, we've got maybe this many sites and those ones are going to be more suitable in the future, or they're going to give us more time in the future, we think, under climate change projections, so we could prioritise those sites under the other ones. But it's not, you know, it's not like I say, we haven't got all the answers with climate, it's just another thing to put into the mix. Also, the other thing is, you know, all these interactions that we have. So this was trying to sort of show how, in this case, Melanpyrum sylvaticum sits within its woodland system. So I've already talked to several people about Melanpyrum today, so I'm slightly obsessed, but it's dispersed by wood ants, it's a pollinator, it's a host to rust fungi, it parasitises birch trees, all these different interactions. They sort of can be layered within the climatic niche. So the climatic niche is really coarse, but all those sorts of things will dictate where within that climatic envelope that species can occur. So again, you're all experts on your particular species. I'm an expert on Melanpyrum. I know that I wouldn't just plonk it in some grassland because it can't parasitise grasses, you know. So again, people will try and sort of say climate models, they don't incorporate all this sort of stuff, and so that means they're rubbish. That doesn't mean they're rubbish, it just means you have to use them as part of a suite of tools. Okay, so if I convince you that maybe you should think about SDMs and climate niche models, how do you access them? Well, I tend to walk down the corridor and ask Dr. Joe Bellis to run some models, and he's very technical. The models that he's running when we're doing local scale things might take 5 days to run, so he'll set them running and then do something else for a little while. But of course, not everybody has a very talented postdoctoral researcher that they can call on. So you might be able to make connections with universities who can do this sort of stuff, and actually they make quite nice student projects, especially if you're not expecting the 5-day model approach, if you're expecting something that can be a bit coarser. So what you'd need is some distribution data and some climate data, Now, anybody that runs any of the climate models knows where to find the climate data. We tend to use WorldClim, but there's lots of other different projections and climatic data. That's usually downloadable as rasters, which are GIS, geospatially referenced sort of TIFF files. They're often enormous, but so you just need like a bigger computer. So that's part of the process. And then we put them into these ensemble models. They tend to be ensemble models. That means that instead of just one model, you're using a set of them, because each algorithm and set of models has slightly different pros and cons. So if you use the ensemble approach, you can get a consensus from the different models, and that improves your confidence in how good they're going to be. And then you get out the bottom some sort of map like I was showing you before that says suitability versus not. If you want to try them yourself, there are some packages that are open source. I started with Diva, so that was quite a long time ago. I'm a field-trained botanist as part of my PhD, but I was really interested in the climate question, so I started using Diva. You can also use Maxent, and actually, if anyone tells you that Maxent isn't very good, don't believe them, because we've come full circle. There was a lot of snobbishness about Maxent because it was one of the first SDMs that was like publicly available. And then like the technicians were a bit like, oh, we don't like that, that's not very nice. But actually, there's been a few papers recently that have proved that Maxent is really good for the sort of questions that we would be asking as translocation people. And then if you're really techie and you want to get some coding done, then there's a huge long list of packages in R, the language that we use for our research. And they do all sorts of amazing things, but you do have to have that sort of, you have to be able to code and use the packages. So, or ask Joe to do it for you. So we could also rely on proxies. If you can't look at get models to work, we could actually sort of just take the learnings from other species. And so this is some more work from Joe's recent paper that says, after doing all the models, if we wanted to maintain climate site suitability, we would have to, on average, move things 6 or 7 degrees poleward to maintain climate suitability. So we could use those sorts of proxies, from other species and other studies, and then things like reciprocal transplants are things that we can do in the plant world, which maybe aren't available to the animal people, but I think they're very, very powerful. So using reciprocal transplants is a fantastic thing to do. Finally, I think I'm probably running out of time a bit. I just wanted to do a quick plug. It's a couple of years old now, but we had a special issue, or special focus they called it, on plant translocations and climate change in Journal of Ecology from 2021, I think. We had a load of different approaches in there, some of Joe's work's in there, and also I was working a lot with foresters, and the forestry people have these enormous data sets. They do all their seed provenancing and all that sort of thing, so we really could sort of benefit from their approaches. So if you're interested in that stuff, it's all open access, so you should be able to get hold of it, I think, anyway, or you can email me if not. Right, thank you very much. There's my email. The thing underneath is the GitHub, so we put our code up on GitHub if you're interested. And I just wanted to make a plug for Applied Ecology Resources, because it's an online platform that we've started at the British Ecological Society. It's got a journal that's linked to it, and it's very practice focused. And so we're going to be storing databases and things like that, and hopefully the European database will go up onto AER as well. Okay, thanks.